So this is where Israel is today, and this is where Israelis are today. And we have to add to that battle fatigue. Now, here's a typical Israeli family. This one is an infantry officer. He served almost a year in Gaza and saw a lot of combat. This one's only 15. She's in 10th grade in Jerusalem High School. That's the mother who did 2 years of national service, which is an acceptable alternative for someone who is an Orthodox Jew. This one up here is a lieutenant commander in the Israeli Navy and has a little boat. Not so little. And next to him is his bride, who served 3 years in the Navy, and you can see the connection there, right? This is the father, who served 3 years in the infantry, a good 30 years ago, and served in a couple of wars, did 20 years of reserve duty after that. And this one is an officer, a brand new officer in Israel's military intelligence. And this guy graduated from high school, and instead of going straight into the army, he's doing a year of service, which involves helping rebuild some of the Israeli communities that were decimated on October 7th last year. Now, by now, some of you probably know who these people are. That's my son. And this is, in many ways, a typical Israeli family, because practically every Israeli family has been touched by the war. My son used to be the vice principal of a large Jerusalem high school. He's been to 9 funerals of former students from that high school. They were killed in combat. So with all that figured alongside the Lebanon ceasefire, the toughest question you can ask an Israeli these days is the simplest one. How are you? It's been more than a year since Hamas terrorists overran Israeli villages near Gaza, shredding Israel's pitiful defenses, massacring 1,200 people, and kidnapping 250 others. It's a trauma equal to, even surpassing, the surprise attack by Egypt and Syria 50 years ago, setting off the 1973 war known as the Yom Kippur War. In September last year, some guy wrote an article saying it's time to get over the trauma of 1973. Okay, you know who it was, right? Timing is everything. I still think it's necessary to get over that trauma, and what we've done is put a new trauma in its place. So if you ask the question of an Israeli, how are you? It sets off a conflict. Maybe they just had a birthday or celebrating a wedding, as we did, or welcomed a new child or grandchild. But October 7th hangs over everything. Many Israelis have lost friends or family members in the Hamas massacre and the wars that followed. Hundreds of thousands have served in the military, in the reserves. The hostages are still in Hamas tunnels. We know that these 6 were murdered. They were murdered as Israeli troops approached in a tunnel. We don't know how many of the 100 others are still alive, and if they are, what kind of shape they're in. We assume the worst. Mixed feelings doesn't begin to describe what's going on in our heads. The trauma doesn't only come from the deaths and injuries. It comes from the realization that the Israeli military, the one body in the country that had received automatic trust and support let everyone down in the worst possible way. None of this, as I said before, is meant to downplay the suffering of the Palestinians in Gaza over the past 11 months. I suspect you've seen a lot of that in news reports here. The blame for the deaths, injuries, and destructions on both sides falls totally on Hamas, Hezbollah, and their Iranian sponsors. Not a hair would have fallen from the head of a Palestinian child. Not a window would have been broken or shattered in a building in Lebanon if the Iran proxies had not attacked Israel. The Army's inquiry into what happened in Kibbutz Be'eri shows how badly Israel's army failed on October 7th. Thousands of terrorists began flooding across the Gaza border at 6:30 in the morning. A Saturday, Shabbat, also Simchat Torah. But Israeli forces didn't manage to enter Be'eri until 1:30 in the afternoon. For 7 hours, the overmatched, heroic, but tiny local militia battled the bloodthirsty killers and the rapists practically alone. By the time it was over, 132 Israelis were dead, 31 others were taken hostage from Be'eri alone. As residents cowered in their safe rooms, they pleaded one after the other, dozens, hundreds of times, "Where is the army?" The terrorists broke into most of those safe rooms, butchered and raped the civilians inside, burned many of the houses. All this while the army was trying to get its act together. But here's the catch. There's nothing new here. We knew about all that. It's been reconstructed and replayed and documented over and over again. The question the inquiry doesn't answer is, why? So if you ask the question, how are you? Israelis have to juggle whatever personal joy they've seen since October 7th with an overwhelming collection of negative feelings. Disillusion, anger, mistrust, sadness. Disillusion over the failure of the Israeli military intelligence to grasp the significance of the months of Hamas preparation, many of them out in the open for the October 7th attack. They practiced attacking a mock kibbutz within view of the border. They sent Palestinians to attack the fence. They called it the March of Return, time and time again over the last couple of years. Right out there in the open. Everybody could see it. There's anger over the inability of the military to stop the attack once it started. There is mistrust of the Israeli government over its clumsy handling of the war and the international crisis set off by the attack and by Israel's counterattack. Note carefully, I'm not calling it retaliation. It's not retaliation. Israel is counterattacking, still is, to protect itself from further attacks by Palestinians and Lebanese. And most of all, sadness. Sadness over the death toll that climbs every day as soldiers are killed in combat, over the fate of the hostages still held by Hamas and its allies in Gaza. This photo is from the funeral of our neighbor's son. This is not just theory. Mental health experts point to troubling trends. Among the findings, 1/3 of women and 1/5 of men report high levels of traumatic stress, about double the level before the war. 1 in 4 Israelis suffer from substance abuse, again, about double the level before October 7th. The main problem is the expectations. A proper Israeli military deployment on October 7th would have resulted in the quick wiping out of the Hamas terrorists, most of them on the other side of the border, with minimum casualties among Israelis, both military and civilian. It's that simple. Then there would have been an outcry of pro-Palestinian types across the country and around the world. How dare the Israelis kill all these Palestinians who all they wanted to do was infiltrate and kill Jews? Fine, we can deal with that. But having lived with the lesson of the mistaken interpretation of intelligence warnings before the 1973 war, when intelligence warnings were available that the Egyptians and the Syrians were preparing for war, and the concept, they even use that word in Hebrew, conceptia, the concept was that it ain't going to happen, and surprise, surprise, on Yom Kippur it did. Israelis had the right to expect that such a colossal failure would never happen again. Yet it did. The Army's report on its own failures at Kibbutz Be'eri does not touch on that because it starts its examination on October 7th. As my 8th grade history teacher here at the Hoagland School in the other end of Fort Wayne used to say, everything depends on where you start your history. Everyone knows the real failure was in the months and years before. That's a tunnel. There's a truck in the tunnel, for heaven's sakes. Israel knew that Hamas was smuggling weapons across the border with Egypt. Hamas even smuggled a full-scale tunneling machine of the type used to dig subways. There's no way Israel didn't know about that. Israel funneled hundreds of millions of dollars worth of Qatari cash to the Hamas, assuming it would be quiet, all the while knowing full well that much of the cash was going literally underground. The Hamas attack tunnel network is longer than the London Underground, mile for mile. It extends under hospitals, schools, neighborhoods, with entrances inside mosques, apartments, schools, all of these things that are supposed to be sacrosanct and not part of conflict. Hamas knew what it was doing. It knew that Israel would hesitate to attack a mosque or a school or a hospital, and that's where they put their command post, under Shifa Hospital. When I knew it, there was a great hummus place across the street. I spent back in the day at least one day a week in Gaza. I know it well. It's a whole lot different now because in the 30 years since I spent those days in Gaza, Gaza has been transformed from the dusty, downtrodden complex I knew when I covered the territory in the 1990s to a mixture of new apartment buildings, fancy villas, shopping malls, alongside the squalid refugee camps with their poor, exploited Palestinians preserved for propaganda purposes and TV news backdrops. How often do you see that in a news report? My guess is not very. Now, this is a book, if you want to get into this more deeply, this book has chapter and verse of how Arab nations cynically exploited Palestinian refugees and turned them into cannon fodder. It's by my friend Einat Wilf, and lays it all out. It's available on Amazon. It's not a quick read, but it's worthwhile to anyone who really wants to take this seriously. Now much of Gaza has been destroyed. Also destroyed by Hamas massacres are the idea of a two-state solution. Very few Israelis would agree to a Hamas-led Palestinian state next door these days. And another casualty is Israel's faith in their own future. The empty seats at this table in Hachshut Square in Tel Aviv symbolize the tragedy, the anger, and the sadness here. This is one focus of huge demonstrations demanding a deal to free the hostages in the face of government decisions or non-decisions. We'll get to that. Rebuilding faith is the most critical challenge facing Israel today. It won't begin until the wars are over and the discredited military and political leadership is replaced. So that's the failure of October 7th. Let me emphasize once again I'm not blaming, nor should anyone blame Israel for this atrocity, the pogrom. That's all on Hamas. That said, Israel has made just about every conceivable mistake in handling the conflict. The ceasefire in Lebanon changes a lot or changes little, depends on what you expect. By definition, a ceasefire is a partial measure. Maybe that's why if you read the word in a news report, it's always preceded by another word like shaky ceasefire, tenuous ceasefire, and the like. Do you ever see it without that? I don't. It's true, most ceasefires break down, and this one might as well. The results of Israel's year of warfare against Hezbollah are impressive. Most of the terror group's leaders have been eliminated, along with most of its 150,000 rockets supplied by Iran. The exploding pagers, is there anybody here who doesn't know what I'm talking about? Exploding pagers? Okay, I won't go into that. In September, right, it showed the extent of Israel's intelligence and planning. So why did it take a year? Neither war in Gaza or Lebanon should ever have lasted that long. That indicates the real problem. The same Israeli leaders, political and military, who presided over the failure to stop the barbaric invasion of October 7, 2023, are still in power. They are the same ones who have let the conflicts on two borders drag on for more than a year. Instead of finding a way out, Israel plays into the hands of its enemies. Israel's military and society, actually the same thing since the army relies on reservists, are not built to carry on wars for so long, much less wars on two fronts. Hamas, Hezbollah, and their sponsors in Iran know that. What Israel needed was a plan to wrap up the Gaza conflict in 2 or 3 weeks. Would that mean destruction of Hamas and elimination of the terrorist group for all time? Of course not. Given the failures of the government and military in allowing Hamas to arm itself for years with Qatari money funneled knowingly through Israel and Iranian weapons smuggled across and under the Egyptian border, such an idea of total victory, as outlined again and again and again by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, was never attainable. Israel is to blame only for its failure to prevent the assault, and then its failure to free as many hostages as possible to port. That support would have been crucial to get out of the other corner, the war in Lebanon. More than a year of Hezbollah drone and rocket barrages and Israeli counterstrikes have made Israel's north uninhabitable and created tens of thousands of internal refugees, a term that used to apply only to Syria during its civil war, in both Israel and Lebanon. Hezbollah started attacking Israel a day after the Hamas rampage in southern Israel in solidarity with Hamas. Hezbollah fired more than 10,000 rockets at Israel over the past year. Keep in mind that nothing was happening on the Israel-Lebanon border on October 7th last year, but October 8th, Hezbollah started firing rockets in solidarity with Hamas. Some of the damage comes from Israel's own efforts to shoot down the rockets. This is a car near Tel Aviv. A fragment of an incoming rocket hit it. Luckily, it was parked. No one was inside. Now, let's scale this up to American levels. Say this car was parked in Fort Wayne. Now, say that 65,000 terrorists from Mexico stormed across the border and killed 35,000 Texans. Then, terrorists from Canada, in solidarity with their Mexican brothers, fired 350,000 rockets at all parts of the U.S. That's the scale we're dealing with here. Israel is a nation of 10 million people. The United States has more than 300 million. I'm just doing simple math here, multiplying by 30. And I'm a liberal arts guy. What do I know from math, right? So, what happens in this scenario? Seattle is evacuated. Detroit is evacuated. Cleveland is evacuated. Albany is evacuated. You get the idea? What would the U.S. do? Would it wait a year? Would it warn the Mexicans, Canadians exactly where it's going to strike to give civilians a chance to get out of the way? Israel does that, both Gaza and Lebanon. Would it send thousands of tons of food and supplies into the war zones? Did the U.S. ever do that? In Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan? We can go back to World War II if we want, but we don't even need to. Did anyone expect the U.S. to do that? So there are assumptions about this war that have never been made in warfare before. People talk of war crimes. Folks, war itself is a crime. The best war is the one that isn't fought. Sometimes there's no choice, like when a country is hit with unprovoked attacks and thousands of rockets. In one of its more complex missions, Israel eliminated the longtime leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, who addressed and inflamed his people for many years like this from an underground bunker. And this is the time to say hi to the folks on the live stream. It's kind of the same thing. There is no objective reason why Israel must face the Iran-backed Hezbollah terrorists by itself. Every time they fire a rocket or launch a drone, they are violating UN Security Council 1701, passed in 2006, imposing a ceasefire and requiring Hezbollah to move away from the border back to the Litani River. It should have been possible to enlist world support in stopping Hezbollah barrages before Israel's north burned. Who knows? Perhaps Hezbollah would have acted on its own pledge to stop attacking Israel when the Gaza war ended. Instead, Israel's getting dragged into a months-long conflict gave time to the Iran-linked pro-Hamas groups around the world and on American campuses to ratchet up their protests, turn public opinion away from Israel and toward the beleaguered Palestinians, even though all this is the fault of Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. So now what? There are ways out of this, but not with the present Israeli leadership. Netanyahu is constrained politically by the most extreme of his coalition partners who demand an all-out war in Gaza and Lebanon. By the way, here you see the relative size. Oops, I'm sorry. That was me doing the wrong thing again. The relative size of Israel, I can barely get my thing on it, compared to the red, which is all the Arab world. And the caption there says, Israel occupier? Okay. This is the problem when you see only Israel and the West Bank and Gaza Strip. You think, gee, it's a huge territory. The whole thing's about the size of New Jersey. Going there tomorrow, driving home from the airport to a friend of mine. It's going to take a half-hour drive and go through, or hour drive. I'm going to go through most of New Jersey. And you can get from one end of Israel to the other in 4 hours on a highway. You know, that's all there is. And yet, you know, this is the problem. And the context of this, as well as, again, the fall of the Assad regime in Syria and how it compares to all this. Syria is, I'm trying to get the right button this time. Syria's around here somewhere, right? Bordering Israel. So only if the world wakes up and realizes the target of these terrorists is not Israel alone, but the West as a whole, and the perpetrators are not only local terrorists, but Iran, only then might world powers mobilize to put a stop to this dangerously escalating conflict. Then there's Yemen. I want to see if I can find it here. Yemen is here. I'm going to switch the slide so you'll see a much closer image of it, but remember, it's just that little bit there. Okay? You see where it says Yemen. And all the green stuff going up there is the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Another Iran proxy, the Houthis, have been disrupting shipping through the Red Sea, which is That's this up here. And then into this area here. Supposedly, again, in solidarity with Hamas. Now, I've been covering a lot of war in my time, and I've read about a lot of wars, and I've yet to come across a war that someone else joined in solidarity with somebody else. There was World War II, where the two sides, the Germans and the Japanese, were allies, but solidarity, really? So the Houthis have been forcing ships either not to go through the Bab el-Mandeb Straits at all, or to declare that this particular ship has not set down in an Israeli port for at least 2 years. I mean, that's just amazing. And, of course, since it's in solidarity with Hamas, they have to fire an occasional rocket at Israel, like the one on Sunday. There was another one a couple of days ago. This one got through the defenses. It wasn't a rocket, it was a drone, which somehow managed to go across Egypt, around the Mediterranean, and into Israel, and hit a building. Luckily, no one was hurt. But that came from Yemen. Yemen is 2,000 miles away. No, wait, 1,600 miles away from Israel. Sorry, I did the kilometers there. It's 1,600 miles away from Israel. So shouldn't be obvious there's something else going on here? The Houthis are disrupting the shipping of 1/5 of the world's oil and liquefied gas. That's what Iran wants. That's why the West needs to step in here. It has a start with naval forces off the coast of Yemen and attacks on the Houthi positions, and they're doing a very nice job there, but the real problem is Iran, again. But even if the West steps up, there still needs to be a change of political and military leadership in Israel. The team that allowed October 7th to happen, then mishandled the wars on both fronts, cannot be trusted to extract Israel from this trap with minimum damage. That might be the most painful element for Israelis. They can't trust their government and military to do the right thing. Once upon a time, not so long ago, that trust was a given. Israel is at fault for letting Qatar finance the Hamas terrorist tunnel network, but it's Hamas and its sponsors who are fully to blame for the massacre, rape, torture, and mutilation of more than 1,200 Israelis and the kidnapping of more than 200 others last October 7th, as well as the damage and the suffering that has followed Israel's counterattack. That charming fellow is Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas mastermind of the October 7th massacre. Israel finally drove him out of the tunnels and killed him in October this year. Testimony and evidence continue to pile up, documenting the atrocities committed by thousands of terrorists from Hamas who crossed the border. There's a 43-minute video compiled from body cameras of the terrorists themselves, graphically and literally showing not only the atrocities, but the joy with which they were perpetrated and the hero's welcome that the terrorists receive back home in Gaza, carrying mutilated corpses and bodies of hostages. That video is available to the world. You can find it easily enough, but it's not available in Israel. The Israeli government, in one of its few correct steps since October 7th last year, decided its people were traumatized enough without seeing the Hamas horrors on their own screens. I have a 23-minute version of that video. I've tried watching it, but I can't get past the first 2 minutes. It's that horrible. And I'm a journalist who has covered awful events like Hamas suicide bombings 25 years ago, including one where my daughter could well have been caught on a bus. But thank God she was on the bus in front of the one that blew up. A colleague standing next to me wasn't so lucky. His son was killed. Even so, I stopped I hit the stop button after 2 minutes of this. I don't recommend it to anybody to watch unless you believe that I'm making all this up. The leaders of Hamas, many of whom started out in Gaza and fled to the riches of their exile in Qatar, are kept in the luxurious style of visiting dignitaries, though their only actual accomplishments are killing Israelis and enslaving their own people. There's Ismail Haniyeh, who used to command Hamas from the Shati refugee camp on the Gaza beach when I knew him, before he left for more comfortable accommodations. He was also a lot skinnier back then. He met his end in August in what's euphemistically described as a mysterious bombing in a guest house in Iran. Iran responded by firing nearly 200 missiles at Israel. What would you do if someone fired 200 times 30, 6,000 missiles at you for taking out a terrorist? I don't think you would stand by quietly. Khaled Mashal is considered the senior Hamas guy these days. He was once the target of a botched Israeli assassination attempt. This leadership keeps the Qatar money flowing, plans terrorist attacks, and lives the good life while their people back home in Gaza suffer, mostly because of the many millions of dollars supplied by Qatar and others to go underground for terrorist tunnels and above ground for rockets aimed at Israel instead of, say, basic infrastructure in Gaza. The larger question is, does the U.S. want to restore its credibility as a power in the Mideast and the world, or does it want to keep looking for painless ways out of crises by turning on its allies? Excuse me for living, but I think there's only one proper answer to that. So let's sum up. Hamas is totally to blame for the pogrom of October 7th last year and all the damage that has resulted from Israel's counterattack. It's not retaliation, as I said before, despite what you see in the media, and I can do another lecture about that, and I'll spare you. Israel's failings follow on from that, ignoring intelligence warnings, leaving the Gaza border unguarded, depending too much on electronics and sophisticated devices when faced by a primitive but heavily armed enemy, and going back 10 years, believing Hamas could be domesticated or deterred by millions of dollars from Qatar. Prolonging the war to the extent that initial world support weakened and disappeared, leaving Israel alone to fight on two fronts. On the other hand, the U.S. and allies helped repel that attack from Iran in April. Hundreds of rockets and drones headed for Israel. Only a few got through. Now there's a flotilla of American Navy ships in the region aimed at persuading Iran that it's not healthy to attack Israel again. An unprecedented show of support for Israel. And here's the main lesson. A government, any government, is elected to make decisions, easy or hard. Israel has refused to do that. I won't go into the reasons, but rescuing all the hostages and eliminating Hamas once and for all are incompatible goals. It just can't be done. But Israel has not made the hard choice. It has also not made the hard choice about how Gaza should be administered after the war. So there are no long-term goals. Likewise, Israel maintains the outdated us against the world, we don't need any help posture. If it was ever true, it certainly isn't now. Iran is a threat to the Western world, not just Israel. Iran is behind Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen. Israel needs to develop its alliances, not alienate its partners. That brings us to the subject I'm not going to comment on, except for the context of Israel and the Mideast. Some Israelis are raising their shot glasses and cheering the victory of Donald Trump in the U.S. presidential election. Other Israelis are stomping away in anger and frustration. Many say Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is a mini Trump, even wearing a long red tie like Trump's when he's in Washington. See it there? In that group, many believe it's a good thing, giving Netanyahu an inside track when it comes to coordinating and guiding policies together with Trump. Others believe it's a disaster for both countries, giving their shared style of divisive, inflammatory leadership. None of these views matter. Instead, following Trump's victory, Israel needs to take a long step back, a very deep breath, and a cool assessment of how to proceed. A proper Israeli response has several levels. The immediate challenge is to how to handle wars on two fronts as Trump takes office. Then there's the matter of shaping policy to account for the many actions the unpredictable Trump might adopt as president. Also, Israel must see to it that the Western world takes on its burden in handling Iran. In other words, as hard as this might sound, Israelis must put all their passions aside and deal with this new situation in a pragmatic way. Trump has given mixed signals concerning the war in Gaza and in Lebanon. There are reports he's demanded that Israel must end the wars before he takes office January 20th. There are also reports he wants Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon to be crushed. The most logical Israeli position, though it might be hard to accomplish, is to fulfill both goals. Find a way to end the wars, preserve Israel's military accomplishments, solidify them with diplomatic arrangements, including freedom for the Israeli hostages held by Hamas for more than 14 months. Difficult? For sure. Impossible? You won't know till you try. Not on this list of quick fixes is Iran. No doubt that Trump's team would love to see Iran handled by Israel alone, and then Israel could absorb all the return fire alone. Israel needs to resist that. It could be part of a quiet package deal with Washington, fulfilling its demands in Gaza and Lebanon, while the U.S. keeps its navy on Iran's doorstep, ready to retaliate if provoked. After all, Iran is a world problem, not only Israel's. The same applies to the Houthis in Lebanon. That big green thing over there is Iran. The little red thing, again, 1,600 kilometers away, miles away, is Israel. So what should Israel do about the two wars in the meantime? Maybe we can define the problem away. We've been calling this a war. How about if we just called it the latest battle? Israel has been fighting Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon for decades. This is the largest battle. Much has been accomplished. Total victory can be a long-term goal. Israel can declare a ceasefire, get back as many hostages as it can, and live to fight the next battle, which will inevitably come, no matter how long this one goes on. That's the way out toward restoring some balance, restoring crucial alliances, and restoring a sense of unity in Israel. Demonstrations every Saturday night of hundreds of thousands of Israelis, or tens of thousands, are part of the landscape now. But none of this will happen until the leadership, civilian and military, is changed, totally replaced. The argument that you can't change leaders during a war is an excuse, not a solution. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis filling the streets of Tel Aviv must not be ignored. So in the end, much depends on what Israel does. In 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt declared, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." In Israel of 2024, I'd say, exaggerating slightly, the only thing we have to fear is ourselves. And I'll be glad to answer questions if I didn't answer them already. Thank you. I appreciate if you'd identify yourselves before you ask a question.
Testing. Hi, Mark. I'm Fran Adler. I actually have two questions. It appears that Netanyahu might be deliberately prolonging and carrying on this long, long war that seems to have two contrary, impossible to meet goals to keep himself in power and protect himself from the court cases. Is that just imagination, or is that what you think he's doing?
Let's do one question at a time. Don't give the mic back, or you can if you like. I think it's fairly obvious that Netanyahu is keeping the wars going because he can't get any kind of a solution through his cabinet. I don't think the court cases have much to do with it, but he has extremists in his cabinet, whom I mentioned earlier, who are looking for a total, complete, absolute victory, and there are even some people, I'll leave off the adjective, who want to resettle Gaza. Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005 and took its 18 settlements out and 8,500 settlers with them. And there are people who actually want to go back, as though that's going to solve the problem. Now, I can tell you from personal experience that Gaza and the settlements, the last few years they were there, were no heaven on earth. The settlers were screaming bloody murder. Can't you stop them from firing rockets at us all the time? And they were running around Gaza in buses, which are actually trucks with concrete walls that thick, so that whatever they fired on wouldn't get through. But they want to go resettle Gaza. These are people in the government. So fairly clearly, if Netanyahu wants to stay in power, and he does, he has to accommodate that, and so he can't, unless he actually shows some courage and some political wisdom and a bit of self-sacrifice, force through a plan of how to deal with Gaza after the war. So there's one question. You had another one? Sorry, Michael.
I don't know if you happened to see today's Journal Gazette, but there was a cartoon on the editorial page that showed falling dominoes. And the dominoes were Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran at the bottom with all those dominoes falling. Do you think that's realistic? And if they all fall, what happens?
It's a little bit one-dimensional. It's not that easy, but I see where the guy's coming from. There is a train of thought that Iran has taken a serious shot here. Its proxies who it really depended on to create havoc in the Middle East have been, I won't say put out of business, but have been seriously weakened. And this might very well have contributed to the idea that the rebels in Syria could depose Assad, who also is an ally of Iran. I think what I didn't mention earlier, it's probably a good time to do it, is that the Assad father and son show, they're Alawite Muslims. And Lavie is a small faction of Shia Muslim, which is Iran, and that's a small fraction of the Muslim world. So you're talking about a fraction of a fraction. And this is why I said that in 2012 I was saying, why are they still there? But yeah, it means that Iran has lost most of its power in the Israel area. It's lost Hamas, which is not really functioning. Hezbollah is seriously weakened. Assad just got pitched out, and he's in Moscow. I'm sure he's happy there. So yeah, I can see how someone would think it might be a domino effect.
I'm Glenn Goldstein. I'd say 10 years ago we had a speaker here who had advised 3 American presidents and written 5 books on the conflict. And afterwards, he gave us a wonderful talk, and afterwards we had coffee and cake. And I asked him, you've advised 3 presidents and you've written books. What is the answer? And he said, Glenn, come close. He said, there is no answer. You're a learned man also, and you've been around these areas a long time. You've seen all sides. You understand it. Is there an answer?
It's a particular American characteristic to believe that every problem has a solution. This is the only place in the world that actually believes that. There is not an answer for, let's say, the Israel-Palestinian issue until someone comes and imposes one. And right now, there isn't anyone who can do that. The Palestinians have turned down 2 offers of a state in, as I mentioned before, the equivalent of the West Bank, Gaza, and a quarter in between. Now, and only in 2008. They turned one down in 2000 also. And that's not coming back, not after this. Israel is not going to make an offer like that again. And so there are those who I mentioned in the government who want to annex the West Bank altogether. Who knows what they want to do with Gaza? I think we can use our imaginations. So no, I'm afraid I have to agree with him. And as far as the Middle East as a whole is concerned, there is a realignment going on, which is of very, very interesting proportions. It has to do with the Abraham Accords, where a number of Gulf nations made peace with Israel. Saudi Arabia could well be next. And this could develop into an alliance against Iran and its basic troublemakers. This by itself could change the reality of the Middle East. It already is to some extent. And that could be a way toward imposing a solution on the Palestinians. They're not going to like it. They don't have to. It's like I used to tell my kids when I told them they have to do the dishes. You don't have to like it, you just have to do it. But we're not going to see that any time in the time we have left on earth, I don't think, frankly. Sorry to be such a pessimist. I think we're in a period now, we've seen a year of war. I think we're going to see another several years of flare-ups and clashes. And if this ceasefire lasts 10 years, I would be amazed.
Thank you. Rabbi Meir Bargeron. I have been listening to a lot of analysis out of Israel. There's a very good podcast out of Shalom Hartman Institute with Daniel Hartman, looking at the internal conditions, particularly with the ongoing protests against the government, particularly from the family members of those who are being held hostage. And those protests and the situation with the families has been characterized as political opposition. And I'm wondering your perspective on the continued push from the families for a resolution to the hostage matter, which seems not to be persuasive to the government, and how that is operating in terms of the calculus of the decisions that the Likud government is making in the war.
Well, the Prime Minister has succeeded in labeling everybody who doesn't agree with everything he does as a leftist. And there's no worse thing you can be in Israel than a leftist, right? My son-in-law, the high school teacher, did an experiment once. First he asked, how many kids in this room are leftists? And nobody raised their hands. Then he said, well, what do you think about this policy or that policy? They agreed with all of those policies, which were clearly leftist, but they were not leftists themselves. It's a curse. So he's managed to group all of the people who are demanding release of the hostages or demanding a ceasefire, even a temporary one, to get as many back as we can, as leftists. And therefore, it'll have no effect whatsoever on the government because the government is not set up to make the decisions that need to be made. Just one little factoid that will really, really sound great to you folks. After the Yom Kippur War disaster of 1973, it took until 1977 to pitch the party out. It took them almost 4 years. I don't think we have 4 years, frankly. The economic situation in Israel is going to be all but untenable once everybody wakes up. That may do it. But we need a new leadership. Practically anybody will do. And at this point, I can't tell you when that's going to happen.
As hideous and shocking as October 7th was,
Can you give me your name, please?
I'm sorry, I was still struck by Netanyahu's immediate verbal response. He said, "There will be revenge." And he was so explicit, revenge, and I thought that's a poor choice of words. He didn't say justice of any kind or solution. Was that the harbinger of what we have seen?
No, I don't think so. I don't recall him using that word in Hebrew. I don't recall him using that word in Hebrew. What he basically says is anyone who attacks Israel will pay dearly. That's not revenge. So Israel is not a vengeful society. It is one that seeks safety and security and will do whatever it needs to do to achieve that.
Any additional questions?
If not, I hope you'll indulge me for another 5 minutes. I want to end on a personal note. My birthday was in September 11th to be accurate. Imagine, I'm already 57. Well, the 7's right. Yeah, I was born on 9/11. I got there first. I say that a lot. One of my kids, too. Well, he's not so much a kid. He turned 46 on 9/11 last year. For the first few years, when people heard that my birthday is on 9/11, the date of the worst terrorist attack the United States has ever experienced, they tissed in sympathy and said things like, "What a shame you can't celebrate your birthday anymore." But that started petering out after a few years. 9/11 receded in memory, or it was just history. For example, except for the one that just got married, all of my grandchildren were born after 9/11, and that one was a baby. Several of them had never heard of the attack on 9/11. They do have a pretty good excuse. They're 7,000 miles away from New York, of course. But it's a common reaction now. 9/11 is just another date in history. If we want to teach or learn about it, first we have to explain what happened. All the more so when it comes to the Holocaust. For me and my generation, it's real. My parents were Holocaust survivors. Some of you knew them. I grew up with the Holocaust, but even my children knew of it from a distance. When my son was 16, he asked me permission to go on a school mission to Poland to see the death camps and to learn about the Holocaust. I was livid. No son of mine is ever going to set foot in that graveyard of the Jewish people, I declared. Then we discussed it, and he persuaded me that for his generation, it's important. My son just turned 49. His oldest daughter, as you already know, just got married. So when I see polls show that 20% of American youth don't even know the basic facts about the Holocaust, I say that's pretty good. Only 20%? Considering how long ago it was, why are we surprised? So it all starts from the beginning, teaching what the Holocaust was, who was targeted, and why. Likewise about Israel. It's no surprise to me the youngsters over here can swallow the story that Israelis are colonizers from Europe. Have we taken care to teach them that Jews have lived in the land of Israel continuously for 3,000 years? That when you do archaeology in Israel, you dig up ancient artifacts inscribed in Hebrew? If you dig up something up in America that's only 300 years old, it's not going to come out in English. Even in England, you can dig up an artifact that's more than 2,000 years old in Israel, and my youngest grandkid can read what's written on it. We've been there that long. They won't know unless we teach them. Not only Jewish youth who need to know this stuff backwards and forwards, especially non-Jewish youth. Do we expect black youngsters to know that Jewish leaders marched alongside Martin Luther King for civil rights? That was 60 years ago. So it's not enough for us to complain to each other on anti-social media. We have to reach outside our circles and educate. I'll leave that there as a challenge for all of us. Thank you again. Sure.
In your talk, you said that 1/4 of the Israeli people are suffering from substance abuse. Can you elaborate on that? Is it alcohol or drugs? Is it from fear or nervousness?
I don't know specifically what the substances they're talking about, but I would imagine it's both drugs and alcohol. And it comes from living in a war situation for 14 months when your husband or your son or your grandson might be in a war situation.
How do they get that number, 1/4 of the Israeli people?
It was a reliable survey done by an outlet that I trust.
Very worrisome.
Oh yeah, I mean Israeli drivers are pretty awful to begin with. You should see them now.
Anyone else? I hope that everyone can join us in the social hall, and I want to say a special thank you to Mark for his preparation, the travels he made to get here. Really do appreciate all that you brought to us. Thank you.
Thanks. I hope sometime before I get home I'll get over the jet lag.